These weeks, we're reading about the founding of our people. Of course, there are a lot of stories that are told in Genesis, but the main emphasis of the book is the focus on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we scrutinize their life, and we learn from their every step, and we study their every move, and we examine their relationships and their travails and their deeds and their words. And Rashi tells us in the beginning of next week's parsha, at the end of our parsha, we read about the family of Esau, and it runs through all the generations very quickly. And Rashi compares it to a person sifting through sand. He's trying to find the gem, and he has to go through all the sand and all the pebbles and finding the diamond. Once he finds a diamond, he can discard the pebbles. Similarly, we talk about Esau and his whole family, but really we're trying to get to the story of Jacob. And once we get to the story of Jacob, the family of Jacob, we can focus on what is really important. That's the story of Genesis. It goes into considerable detail, telling us all about the forefathers and all about their families and all about their accomplishments and all about their challenges. And it goes into considerable detail even when it's talking about the tangential characters in the story of the patriarchs. So for example, Parshas Chayei, it tells us about how Abraham instructs his servant Eliezer to go find a wife for Isaac. And chapter 24, we read all the details of the story. He goes with the camels, and he meets Rebekah, and she offers water for him and his camels. And then it repeats it once Eliezer has an audience with Rebekah's family. And Rashi chapter 24 verse 42 tells us, the words of the servants of the forefathers are more cherished by God, more than the Torah of the forefathers' descendants. The story of the forefathers is so important, so critical, even the supporting cast of the patriarchs, it's so critical for us to examine. In this podcast, I want to focus on the supporting actors. Maybe we could call them the antagonists in the story of the forefathers, and they are the four uncles. We have four uncles whose story is told in considerable depth in Genesis. And of course, we're reading about the narratives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. But along the way, we encounter their siblings, the uncles of the Jewish people. And the Torah does expend significant real estate talking about these four uncles. And the word uncle is such a funny word, such a clever word. And the idea of a forefather and a foreuncle, I just can't resist. So who are these four uncles? We have Lot, the brother of Sarah. And then we have Ishmael, the brother of Isaac. And then we have Laban, the brother of Rebekah. And then we have Esau, the brother of Jacob. These four uncles spend a lot of time with the protagonists of the story. There's got to be something about their story that is so significant that we have to spend a lot of time talking about it. What can we discover from the story of the Fouruncles? What are the avuncular lessons that we can deduce? Let's see what we find. So, of course, uncle number one is Lot, the brother of Sarah. He's the nephew of Abraham. He's Abraham's brother Haran's son. And he's traveling with Abraham, and they descend together down to Egypt. And when Abraham claims Sarah to be his sister, Lot is quiet. And when Abraham is enriched, when he's released from Egypt, Lot is also made wealthy. And then there are scuffles between the camps of Abraham and Lot, and Abraham gives him an ultimatum. You go right, and I'll go left. You go left, and I go right. And Lot makes the unfortunate decision to go to Sodom. And he gets taken captive in the world war of Genesis chapter 14. And Abraham is mobilized into action to go save him. And he goes back to Sodom. And then when the time for Sodom to be overturned arrives, he welcomes the angels who come to destroy it into his home. And he bakes for them matzah. And then when the mob congregates around his house, he offers his 2 daughters, take my daughters, but don't touch my guests. And then they urge him to leave, and he leaves with his wife and 2 daughters. His wife turns around, and she gets converted into a pillar of salt. And ultimately, he ends up in a cave with his 2 daughters, and he inebriatedly impregnates his daughters, spawning the forebears of the nations of Ammon and Moab, 2 nations who are barred from intermarrying amongst the Jewish people. So in the book of Genesis, Lot commands a serious amount of attention. And he's also going to be the forebearer, the father of nations that wrangle with the Jewish people, with the descendants of Abraham. So we have Abraham, the forefather, and Lot, the foruncle, and they're in conflict, and their stories are intertwined until they get separated. That is uncle number 1. And uncle number 2 is Ishmael. He's the brother, or the half-brother of Isaac. When Sarah is barren, she arranges that her maidservant Hagar will marry Abraham. And from that union, Ishmael is born. And at age 13, he is circumcised. And a year later, his younger half-brother Isaac is born. And when Isaac is weaned, Ishmael starts causing trouble. He is acting inappropriately. The verse says that he's joking. He's not serious. He is acting in an infantile fashion. He's playing. He's making sport, and Sarah wants him out. Rashi says, what was he doing? Rashi offers 3 opinions. Either he was doing idolatry, or various sexual crimes, or he was trying to murder Isaac. Now, Abraham has some reservations about banishing Ishmael, but ultimately the Almighty tells him to listen to what Sarah is saying, and Ishmael is banished together with his mother. And due to Sarah's displeasure with him, Ishmael is struck with an illness, and he rapidly depletes the water that Abraham provided them for their journey. And Ishmael is on the ropes. He's on the verge of dying. And Hagar places him a few bow shots away, and she prays. And he prays, and the angel shows her the well in the desert, and he is rejuvenated. They travel to Egypt. He becomes an archer. He marries an Egyptian woman, and he makes another reappearance later on. The Midrash actually tells us that Abraham did not give up on Ishmael, and in fact went down to Egypt to visit him. But we discover later on in the story how Ishmael repented, and he was once again welcomed back into Abraham's camp. And when Abraham went to the binding of Isaac, together with him was Ishmael. And when Abraham ultimately passed, Ishmael was present, and he, in deference to Isaac's spiritual superiority, he allowed him to go first in the burial procession of Abraham, and that shows us that he, in fact, repented. So we have uncle number 1, that's Lot, foruncle number 1. And foruncle number 2 is Ishmael. He makes repeated appearances in the stories of the forefathers. And like Lot, like Lot, he fathers a nation that will have repeated run-ins with our nation over the course of the millennia, and continues to do so as we speak. So again, we see a forefather and a foruncle at odds, not just at the beginning, but in a continuous fashion going forward. Foruncle number 3 is Laban, the brother of Rebekah. He is Rebekah's brother, but he's also the father of Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah. And according to the Midrash, he's also the father of Bilhah and Zilpah, the concubines of Jacob. The 2 wives of Jacob were Laban's daughters from his wife, and the 2 concubines were Laban's daughters from his concubines. So he's the uncle of the Jewish people, but he's also the father-in-law of the Jewish people. And he too seems to be an ever-present fixture in Genesis. When Abraham sends his trusty servant Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac, he instructs him to go to his family and to secure a wife. And we know the story. Rebekah offers water for the camels without being prompted to do so. She displays uncommon kindness and generosity, and she's worthy of joining the dynasty of kindness of Abraham. And Eliezer gives her some jewelry, and she runs to show her family, and then we meet Laban. 24:29 of Genesis. Laban ran. He ran outside to go meet this visitor. And Rashi tells us on said verse, why did he run? For what purpose is Laban sprinting outside to meet Eliezer? He saw the jewelry and he said, wow, this man must be really rich. Maybe we could go separate the man from his wealth. So we find out that Laban has some poor qualities. He has a rapacious lust for money. He has avarice. He is the greedy uncle. But then he runs to Eliezer and he welcomes him in and he clears the house out from idolatry. And finally, after some negotiations and some hesitations and some cold feet, Laban signs off on sending Rebekah, not before giving her the iconic blessing that we still today extend to brides. Our sister, may you become into thousands and myriads. But of course, that's not the last that we hear of Laban. The whole parsha last week was dedicated to Jacob navigating the minefield laid out before him by Laban. Again and again, Laban is tricking Jacob. Worked for 7 years for Rachel. Oh, no, sorry. Bait and switch. Now you have Leah. Give me another 7 years. Incredible dishonesty when it comes to finances. And then once the 14 years were over, they have a work for pay arrangement, which Laban changes 100 times. And eventually Jacob is able to shake himself free of Laban and abscond from there with his family and his possessions. Jacob survives the minefield of Laban, and he begins this week's parsha by signaling to Esau that despite living in Laban's proximity for 20 years, he maintained his standing. Now, interestingly, even though this is the last that we hear from Laban in the Torah, like Lot and Ishmael, Laban's descendants also interact with our people. As they just tell us that Bilam, the conniving Gentile prophet that seeks to curse the Jewish people in the book of Numbers, he's either a relative of Laban or he's some sort of emanation of Laban. So just as our foruncle Laban sparred with our forefather Jacob, Laban kind of continued to do so with those that came after him. And finally, we have the fourth uncle, and that's Esau, the brother of Jacob. This is the twin of Jacob. He's the ruddy one. And once these two brothers mature, they go in very different directions. Jacob is a man of the tents. He is honest. His heart is like his mouth. There's no dissonance between what he actually is inside and how he presents himself. He is wholesome. Whereas Esau is the man of the fields. He's deceptive. He has a penchant for violence. And there's a theme that we see that Jacob, he seizes that Esau should have had. He takes his birthright. He takes his blessings. Really, the wife that was destined to marry Esau, Jacob takes that as well. Our sages tell us that Leah was destined to marry Esau and Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel, but Jacob ends up with both. This is a theme that our sages tell us, that there were really supposed to be 4 forefathers. It was supposed to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. And Jacob and Esau were each supposed to be the father of 6 of the 12 tribes. And the plan was for Jacob and Esau to work symbiotically, with Jacob using his tent-dwelling skills to advance the cause of the nation, and he was supposed to work in tandem with Esau manning the fields. That was the plan. But Esau chose a different path, and he fell off the Mount Rushmore of forefathers. But what happened to that 4th spot? That 4th spot, Esau's spot, was actually taken by Jacob. He fulfilled both roles. And that's why he has 2 names. There's Jacob and then there's Israel. And the commentators calculate that the gematria for the word Israel, 541, matches the gematrias of the words Jacob and Satan. So Israel is Jacob plus Satan, meaning that with the persona, with the alter ego of Israel, Jacob was able to embody the good version of Esau. To become Israel, he had to kind of marry the forces of Jacob with the Satan, and thereby overcoming the evil, but maintaining that edge, so to speak. And that is what Israel is. That's the 4th forefather, the good version of Esau. Originally, it was supposed to be 4 forefathers. Jacob and Esau were going to split that last role, but ultimately, Jacob ends up as the sole progenitor of all 12 tribes. And what happens to Esau? Esau is downgraded from a forefather into a foruncle. Jacob takes his birthright, takes his blessings, literally dons his clothing, takes his wife, and all of his responsibilities. And Jacob ends up with the responsibility of managing his 2 forefather identities, and he does so masterfully. And Esau is demoted to being Jacob's sparring mate. And he plots to kill him, and he sends Eliphaz to kill him, and he mobilizes 400 men in our parsha to kill him. But Jacob outmaneuvers him and endures. So if you think about it, we have 4 forefathers. We have Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and Israel. And their storylines are told in the Torah. But the narratives of the 4 forefathers are intertwined with the stories of the 4 uncles, the 4 foils, the 4 uncles who interacted with these 4 forefathers. And the Torah emphasizes the story of these uncles. Now, there are other biological uncles that we know nothing about. So, for example, we know the Torah tells us that Laban had some other sons besides for his daughters. And we don't even know their names. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about them. Yet, by contrast, the Torah does invest considerable time and emphasis on these 4, Lot, Ishmael, Esau, and Laban. I call them not the 4 fathers, the 4 uncles. Why? What is so significant about these 4, Lot, Ishmael, Laban, and Esau? What is the common thread, or is there a common thread amongst their storylines? I'm going to suggest in this podcast that the answer is yes. And they all play a very important role in the development of the forefathers, and consequently in the building blocks of our nation. So first of all, we see that the similarities between these 4 uncles run quite deep. All the forefathers had dramatic departures with their respective, or from their respective 4 uncles. So Abraham, he was matched with Lot. And he gives him an ultimatum. Go right, and I'll go left, and I'll go right. We must depart from each other. And then we have Ishmael. Ishmael was a bad influence on Isaac, and he is banished. He's sent away. And Jacob, of course, absconded from Laban, last week's parsha. And Jacob, after he's renamed Israel, this week's parsha, after Esau tries to provide an overture of peace and union, Jacob, called Israel, of course, at that time, he skillfully and deftly rejects those overtures, and he separates himself from Esau. So what is the significance of these four uncles? I call them Fouruncles. It's one word. I made up that word. Even in my Google Docs, it kept giving me those squiggly red lines under the word Fouruncles. They don't know what it means. So I right-clicked, and I said, add this to my personal dictionary. This is a new word. We made it up here on the Parsha Podcast, and you're learning it right now from the Torch Center in Houston, Texas. There's something called a Fouruncle. What does that mean? Here's the approach I want to suggest. The forefathers, well, they're the building blocks of the Jewish people. And they're laying down the foundation of a nation that will endure forever. This is the nation that's going to stand at the foot of Sinai and hear prophecy, and they're going to be commanded by the Almighty via Moshe to uphold his Torah and to bring his name to the world. This is not an ordinary nation. We're going to be the nation that will serve the role of being God's emissaries and representatives in the world. We're going to be responsible with learning the Almighty's Torah, assimilating it into our bones, and living a higher level of humanity. People inspired and informed by the Word of God. And thereby inspiring all of God's creations and elevating the entire world and finishing the grand ambitions that Abraham had to ultimately reverse the sin of Adam and usher the world towards its utopian perfection. Who founded this nation? What kind of people can construct such a nation? They have to be absolute titans. They have to be the most remarkable people to ever grace this planet. They have to be people who themselves embody the rectified world that they seek to build. That's what it means to be a forefather. And the way the forefathers were themselves chiseled, hewn into the greatest people that ever walked the planet is via tests. A test is a device that can elevate a person. With 10 tests, Abraham managed to catapult himself to a level really resembling Adam before his sin. Isaac was tested repeatedly. Jacob was tested repeatedly. Israel was tested. Each test provided a degree of elevation. The Midrash points out that the word in Hebrew for a test is nisayon, and it shares the same Hebraic root as the word nes, which means to be elevated, to be uplifted, to be brandished up high. The story of Genesis is the story of the foundation of our people. And it's really the story of the forefathers. They were tested repeatedly. But how were they tested? What is the nature of a test constructed for a forefather? Part of the test, we want to suggest, part of the tests of the forefathers was that they had to interact with and be in the proximity of their respective Fouruncles. And the way that the forefathers navigated these relationships, that provides us with a masterclass in how to deal with this type of test, and thereby how to be elevated ourselves. So let's examine this a bit closer. When we study the story of the Fouruncles, we find a remarkable pattern. All of these four uncles have immense, admirable qualities. They all have aspects of their life that are worthy of admiration, that are redeeming. But they all have flaws as well. And there's something wrong with all of them. And more specifically, each respective foruncle has a flaw that overlaps with the most sterling quality of their respective forefather. Now let me repeat that. It's a little wordy. The flaw in each of these foruncles, forunculi, how would you say that? The plural of foruncle. Forunci? I don't know. Each of these foruncles, their flaw was tailored to serve as a foil, to serve as resistance to the specific quality that each of the forefather was bringing to the table. The Almighty tested the forefathers. One of the tests was that the forefather had to be in close proximity, in a close relationship with a foruncle designed to serve as a stress test for the supreme quality of the forefather. And the test was, can the forefather navigate this tricky relationship without having the influence of the respective foruncle diminish the outstanding quality of the forefather? These foruncles are villains, but they're not the typical kind of villain that we think of. They're not totally evil, totally corrupt. Their danger is actually way worse, because it's very easy to reject someone who's totally evil. Their danger was that they weren't totally evil. They had a lot of qualities, but they were able to influence the forefathers in subtle and insidious ways. They had the ability to chip away at their qualities in a slow, call it imperceptible way, until the forefather would no longer harbor his exemplary quality. And this is a test, or this is one of the tests given to the forefathers. And as we shall see, they all succeeded in avoiding the harmful influences of their respective foruncles, and thereby became worthy of building the nation in a glorious fashion. Let's go through the four foruncles one by one. So we know Abraham's primary quality is chesed, kindness, hospitality. Abraham displays otherworldly kindness. And this is what he's going to contribute, one of the things that he's going to contribute to our nation. That's the forefather. That's Abraham. But Lot, his foruncle, he is a test for Abraham to try to destabilize Abraham's kindness. Now, as we mentioned, Lot has some incredible qualities. Sarsadas praise him for being quiet when he could have busted Abraham and Sarah and say, well, no, they're actually married. We see that he has faith and even knows that when it's Passover, when it's Pesach, he baked the matzahs. And he also displays kindness. He acts with superlative kindness when the angels come to overturn Sodom. But there's something off in the kindness of Lot. So first of all, we see that he behaves in such an inappropriate fashion when he offers his daughters to the mob. That's not appropriate kindness. Moreover, it doesn't spill over to his wife. She bristles at his kindness. She's upset that he's even serving salt to the guests. It also does not translate to his descendants. The nations of Ammon and Moab, they come from him. They display an embarrassing lack of kindness and hospitality. And finally, Our sages tell us that Lot had a weakness for sexual crimes. Our sages tell us, the Midrash tells us, that the reason why Lot chose to move to Sodom and Gomorrah is because he craved the illicit licentiousness and promiscuity of those lands. Now in Scripture, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17, the Torah has a very unusual term for a certain sexual crime. It calls it chesed, kindness. There is a corrupt kindness, and that's what Lot represented. And we see, by the way, that at the end he ended up with his daughters because of his corrupt chesed, his corrupt kindness. This is Fouruncle number 1. He has positive qualities. He's not the standard, paradigmatic villain. This is not Haman. This is not Nebuchadnezzar. This is Lot. He's a Fouruncle. He has kindness, but there's something wrong with his kindness. And the Almighty places him with Abraham as a test to see if Abraham's kindness is going to be influenced and damaged and dinged by Lot. And when Abraham manages to successfully divest himself of Lot, without his kindness being damaged, Abraham passes the test. The forefather defeats the Fouruncle. Now, this pattern remains true when we look at Isaac and Ishmael. Like Lot, Ishmael also displays some wonderful qualities. He's not this brutish villain bereft of any redeeming quality. He was trained by Abraham in the ways of kindness. Kindness was not Ishmael's flaw. He also excelled in prayer. We see that his prayer was answered when he was on the brink of dying. He also had self-sacrifice. When he was 13, he could have said to Abraham, no, you're not going to touch me with that sharp scalpel. I'm not going to allow you to circumcise me. But he was willing to do it. Ishmael had some wonderful qualities. But he's not a forefather. He's a Fouruncle. He was in Isaac's proximity, and that served, or could have served, as a way to harm Isaac and to damage Isaac. That was the conflict, the clash of the forefather and the Fouruncle. Now, how exactly did Ishmael try to corrupt Isaac? We know Isaac is the most mysterious of all the forefathers. His story is not so fleshed out in the Torah the way the other forefathers are. Of course, that's by design. So it's hard for us to appreciate what Isaac really stood for. So it might be a little bit difficult for us to try to identify how his Fouruncle tried to damage him. But the answer is actually readily apparent to us when Ishmael is banished. Sarah wants Ishmael banished. Why? Because she saw him laughing. This is in chapter 21, verse 9. And as we mentioned earlier, laughing, what does that mean? Rashi gives us 3 interpretations, either idolatry, adultery, or murder. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the very first thing that we know about Isaac is that even before he was born, God predetermined his name is going to be Yitzchak, Isaac. The word Yitzchak means laughter. More precisely, it means will laugh. And the word that describes the crime of Ishmael that demanded that he be separated from Isaac is he was mitzachet. So Yitzchak, mitzachet, it's the same word. Now, what exactly does this mean? And what's the attribute of Isaac? We know Isaac was very serious. And the word Yitzchak means will laugh. So it's been suggested, this is a much broader subject, but it's been suggested that Isaac represents a certain seriousness in his relationship with the Almighty. But Yitzchak, he will in the future laugh. Ishmael is mitzachek. It's a version of that. Just like, Lot had kindness, but it wasn't quite the kindness of Abraham. Ishmael has this quality of mitzachek, but it's a corrupt version. It's something which is not worthy of giving him a laudatory name. It's not the name of Yitzchak that was given to him by God. This, I say to say, is it idolatry? Does it have some stench of idolatry to it? Is it murder? Is it some of the other horrific crimes? In this lies the conflict between this forefather and his corresponding foruncle. And again, the forefather triumphs and Ishmael is banished. Now Jacob had two identities, and he serves as two forefathers. He's Jacob and he is Israel. And the qualities that Jacob displays are about emes, which means truth, honesty, integrity, being upstanding, being righteous to the core. When he grew up as a young adult, he is described as an ish tam, a wholesome person. The verse tells us 25-27, these two twins grew up, and Esau was a man who knew how to trap. He was a man of the field. Yaakov ish tam, Jacob, is an honest man, is a wholesome man who dwells in the tents. And Rashi tells us, what does it mean that Esau was a trapping man? He would trap, he would ensnare his father with sanctimonious questions. He would present himself in a deceptive way. He would go over to Isaac and say, well, we need a tithe, right? But how do you tithe hay? How do you tithe salt? And his father says, wow, what a righteous kid. Look at Esau. He's so concerned about the mitzvos. He wants to know how to tithe salt and hay. And of course, Esau was really corrupt. But he portrayed himself in a different way. That's what Esau stands for. Jacob is a ish tam, is a wholesome person. He's not an expert in all this deception. Kili botain piv, the way he is in his heart internally, that's exactly how he portrays himself with his mouth. He doesn't use his sharp skills to try to be deceitful. And Esau continues with his deceptive ways. We read in Parshas Toldos how he got married at the age of 40. Why? Well, Isaac, my father, he got married at the age of 40. I'm just like Isaac. That's how Esau sold himself. And Rashi tells us that he's like a pig. The pig, it spreads its feet out. Look at me, I'm kosher. That's Esau. Not kosher, not righteous, but falsely portraying himself as if he were. Jacob is honest. He's a straight shooter. He is full of integrity. But Esau is deceptive. He's a trickster. Jacob is real. Esau is fake. Now, like the other four uncles, Esau also has redeeming qualities. We know he's the paragon of honoring his father. And at least on a theoretical level, we know that he was quite knowledgeable. He knew how to ask those sanctimonious questions. But it wasn't real. It was disingenuous. Our sages tell us that Esau had an unusual burial arrangement. We talked about this in the past. He tried to stop the burial of Jacob. He tried to disallow Jacob's body to be interred in that cave that we talked about. And he was decapitated by Hushim, the deaf son of Jacob's son, Dan. And then his head, now severed from his body, his head rolled into the cave. His body was buried elsewhere. And the commentaries tell us, my grandfather used to always say this point, who was buried in the cave? Only the forefathers. Esau, if you just look at his head, if you were able to remove it from his body, he was indistinguishable from the other people there. In his head, if you just looked at what he knew in his head, on a conceptual, abstract level, he was indistinguishable from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The problem with Esau is that it did not migrate downward. He's dishonest. He's disingenuous. How do we tithe salt and hay? And he's mimicking his father. Oh, I want to get married at 40 as well. His head, his ideals, his ideology, his theoretical way of living, it's not connected to how he behaves. Jacob, the forefather, was in close proximity with this foruncle. Jacob, you're so truthful. You're so wholesome. I'm going to force you to be with someone who's so deceptive. Can you maintain your integrity? Will the forefather overcome the foruncle? Now, because Jacob adopted a second persona as the fourth patriarch, he had another foruncle to have to navigate. And like Esau, Laban also displays a certain degree of lack of integrity. He's always cheating, conniving. He's a chicanerous crook, as we call him, but in a slightly different way than Esau. Esau was dishonest in his character. He wanted acceptance. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be prized by his father. He wanted status and stature. Laban's dishonesty was manifested in monetary ways. Of course, like the other foruncles, Laban also had admirable qualities. He cleaned out the house from idolatry. He's invoking the name of God repeatedly in chapter 24 of Genesis. He acknowledges God's intervention in the arrangement of Isaac and Rebekah. It came from Hashem. Hashem yatzah davar. But he displays again and again a rapacious lust for money. Why did he run towards Eliezer? Well, he thought maybe I could siphon off some of this guy's jewelry. Maybe I could borrow. We call it borrow. Maybe I can appropriate some of his valuables. When he met Jacob in last week's parasha, this is an incredible Rashi. This is in chapter 29, verse 13. After Jacob comes and he rolls off the stone from the well, Laban hears, oh no! Who's here? Jacob, my long-lost nephew. He runs again, and he hugs him, and he kisses him. Look at this Rashi. Rashi says, why is he running? Again, he's running because he thought that Jacob has tons of money. He remembers the last time that one of Abraham's representatives came. 10 camels laden with all kinds of goodies. Oh, there's another one here? Can we maybe separate the man from his money? And he sees Jacob, and Jacob is just by himself. Where are the camels? Where's the whole posse? Where's the whole gang? Why is this incongruent with the last time I met one of these family members? So he said, you know what? Maybe he's hiding the gold underneath his coat. So he went to hug him, and he's patting him down, feeling him everywhere. Maybe he's hiding the money here or there. And then when he turns up with nothing, he starts kissing him. Well, maybe he's hiding it in his mouth. She's kissing him to find where's all the money. That's what Rashi tells us about Laban. Now we know the story. Jacob did come with valuables, but he was mugged along the way by Eliphaz, Esau's son. So he was empty-handed. And that's one of the reasons why Rashi tells us why he cried when he met Rachel. But the flaw that we discover in this, the fourth foruncle with Laban, is that he had an insatiable lust for money. And by the way, Bilam, who came from Laban, was the same. He said, well, I got to fill up my whole house with gold and silver for my services. So this too is going to serve as a foil or a potential foil for Jacob. Jacob is exquisitely honest in all his ways. And we see that when When Laban combed through Jacob's camp at the end of last week's parsha, he did not find a single thing that belonged to him. Jacob understood that everything came from Hashem. Everything that you need, the Almighty will give you. Everything that you don't have, it's because you don't need it. And when Jacob meets Esau in our parsha, he tells him, I have everything. It's more than having a lot. Everything means everything I need, I have. Everything I don't need, I don't have. And everything I have, it must be that I need it. Which is why when he left a few small jugs on the other side of the river, he endangered himself to go get them. And we see how Jacob navigates these interactions despite being in close confines with two foreruncles. Jacob's scintillating qualities were undamaged. Again, the forefather, or in Jacob and Israel's cases, the forefathers triumphed over the foreruncles. Now, this pattern is manifested in other ways as well. Just as the forefathers are going to be confronted, of course, by divine orchestration, with foreruncles who are engineered to try to detract from their sterling qualities, the forefathers are also going to be tested in other ways. They're going to be placed in situations that test the strength of their qualities. So Abraham, he's the paragon of kindness. He is asked to act in a decidedly unkind fashion when the Almighty asks him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Isaac is Yitzchak. He is someone who lives with a certain seriousness. He is called sometimes the dread of Isaac. Maybe he will laugh in the future, but now he operates with steely, stolid seriousness. Yet he is dogged by claims of the jokesters of the generation. They claim that his true father is really Avimelech. See Rashi to the first verse of Toldos. Jacob is instructed, is commanded by his mother to act in a very dishonest way. Go impersonate your brother. Go skirt to the very edge of falsehood and dishonesty. So the forefathers are repeatedly confronted by people and by circumstances that threaten to destabilize their positive qualities. And it is through these tests, through overcoming the challenges of their respective foreruncles, it's through this that they cement their greatness and become the building blocks of the Jewish nation. The roots of our people are very strong and very secure. They're unshakable. When Bilam tries to curse the Jewish people, he says, I'm looking at their roots, and there's no vulnerabilities. I see no place to grip them, to try to damage them. Why? Why are the roots so strong? Because all of them were tested. All of them were exposed to situations and elements and people that could have damaged their qualities. And all of them overcame them. What's the lesson here for us? What are the avuncular lessons, as I like to call it? The Midrash tells us that we are responsible to try to emulate our forefathers. Every man and woman and child and individual from our nation must yearn to have their deeds match the deeds of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are mandated to try to emulate our forefathers. And just like they did, each one knew their respective quality. And of course, we have a lot of qualities, but we have one quality that towers above them all. To develop that and to refine that greatness that we're destined to achieve. To discover our qualities, but also to protect them. Protect our qualities with tenacity. Fend off any attempt to have them compromised. We must protect our qualities. And like the forefathers, all of us have one quality in which we truly shine. And in that quality, that's where we're going to be tested more than any other area. And we have to protect that quality the way we protect the pupils of our eyes. Our greatest potential is going to coincide with the area in which we are tested more than any other area. Our sages tell us, the greater a person is, the stronger and more robust and fearsome is their Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is our Fouruncle. And we have to recognize that specifically in the areas that we are strongest and we have our most potential and where we're destined to really achieve our greatness, that's where we're going to be tested more than any other area. And we have to say, I want to be like the forefathers. What does it mean to be like the forefathers? It means to realize that you're going to be tested in that area, and you have to know that to the degree that you fend off the challenges, that we fend off the challenges of our respective Fouruncle, the people, the situations, the circumstances that are trying to knock us off our course and push us away from our qualities, to the degree that we follow the ways of our forefathers, we too will become the forefathers of our spiritual legacy and dynasty. Let's get to this week's question. We like at the Parsha Podcast to get smarter every week, try to get 1% smarter. But how do you get smarter? You have to raise your IQ. So you have to have one idea, and that's the I, and one question, and that's the Q. And we get smarter about the Parsha, but we also get smarter about other areas of life. The only thing that makes a person actually smarter, you could listen to music, you could do Sudoku, you could do a lot of things, brain stimulation, watch animations that try to trigger parts of your brain, chess problems, try to work on riddles, submit your application for Mensa. The one thing that actually works is Torah. So we're trying to raise our IQ, our Parsha IQ, but also our general IQ. That's what we're doing here in the Parsha Podcast. Here's the question. When Jacob sends a contingency, a contingent or a contingency? I think it's a contingent. I probably should edit this out of the podcast and just make believe like I'm so suave and don't make any mistakes. I'll leave it in because I know it's only the real diehards that are still listening, and you guys will forgive me. When Jacob sends a contingent to meet Esau, he conveys a message to Esau, and he omits something. This is at chapter 32, verse 6. He tells Esau, I have an ox, lots of oxen. I have a donkey, lots of donkeys, and sheep, and servants, and maidservants. And now I want to find favor in the eyes of my master. Jacob omits something. He omits camels. Last week, after Jacob became very wealthy, we read how he acquired camels. This is the final verse of chapter 30. In our parsha, just a few verses later, when he splits the camp, preparing for the worst case scenario, he divides the camp, and the verse talks about camels. Yet, when he sends a message to Esau, he omits any mention of camels. He talks about the oxen, and the donkeys, and the sheep. Why does he omit the camels? Now, I love this question, because such a question can only be the result of a real careful reading of the Torah. Such a subtle nuance. You can read this verse 100 times and miss it every single time. And even if we did notice it, it wouldn't immediately trigger our curiosity. It wouldn't seem to be so significant the first time we read it. But of course, there's nothing insignificant in the Torah. And if there is a type of animal that is missing, it kind of raises the question, why does Jacob omit mentions of camels? So when I heard this question, I thought of an answer of my own. We know when Jacob sold the birthright to Esau, Esau asked that the food be poured down his throat. And Rashi tells us like a camel. So maybe Jacob didn't want to bring up that sore subject at a time where he was worried about what Esau was going to do to him. So he says, I'll just skip that. I'm not going to mention the camel. I don't want to invoke in any way. I don't want to trigger Esau by talking about the sale of the birthright. That's the thought that I had. But the Meshech Chochmah, one of the great commentators on the Torah, he says something amazing. He says that the camel is one of the few animals that has one of the kosher signs but not the other. So of course, to be kosher, an animal must chew its cud and have split hooves. Now most animals have either both or none. The camel is unique in that it does, in fact, chew its cud, but it does not have split hooves. Now, for all practical purposes, it just means that it's completely not kosher. It's not half not kosher. It's completely not kosher because you need both. And if you don't have both, then you have effectively nothing. But the camel represents a mixture of good and bad. Now we know the sin of Adam, it was when he ate from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And what his sin did to humanity on a physiological level was that he caused a mixture of good and bad. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they made tremendous strides in reversing the sin of Adam. And therefore, suggests the Meshech Chochmah, part of the message of Jacob is that I don't have any camels. Yes, I may have a literal camel, but I have done such tremendous efforts in separating, in clarifying the good from the bad, that on a philosophical level, there are no camels in my camp. Yes, I have an ox. Ox, it's got both signs of being kosher. And you know what? I have a donkey as well. And a donkey is totally not kosher by any standard. It's got none of the signs. That represents separation. Camels, it's a mixture. That does not exist over here. And he adds, the Meshech Chochmah does, that Rebekah, when she traveled back with Eliezer, the Torah tells us that she traveled on a camel. And that is symbolic. That is hinting to us that she is destined to bear one kosher and one not kosher. She's a mixture of good and bad. She's going to have both Jacob and Esau. The reason why I love this is because it's such a subtlety. You have to read the Torah so carefully to pick up such a nuance and to use it to develop into such a powerful insight. Absolutely amazing. I thank you for listening and joining us this week in the Parsha Podcast. Have an incredible rest of your day. Have an exquisite rest of your week. And have the best Shabbos of your life. Please, God, upcoming, send me an email with your questions, comments, and feedback. rabbiwolf@gmail.com. Until next week, take care. Stay safe. Stay strong. Please, God, we will gather together again with the help of the Almighty in good health and in great spirits. Please, God, next week.